The news that Jim Jones may be facing life in jail is now spreading like wildfire, leaving the hip-hop community in full astonishment. That's just at the moment when as if his legal issues couldn't get any worse, the FBI has found fresh, incriminating evidence that might put a stop to his good followers' outrage. Insiders are rushing, and the music business is preparing for the fallout, as the entire scope of Jim Jones's alleged criminal participation reveals reports that are now coming to light. And while some sources believe this is just a witch hunt, others say the proof is so specific that even Jim's closest friends and family are no longer able to defend him. But what precisely did the FBI discover? And might this really be the end of the Dipset? Legend's career and freedom? Or is there a twist that nobody anticipated? The streets are aflutter and the rumors are out of hand. Who did what? Other factors are at play, but most significantly, is Jim Jones about to lose everything? Fasten your seatbelts because we're about to dive into the largest hip-hop scandal of the year. The unexpected news that Jim Jones had been caught in a large-scale FBI sting operation shocked the hip-hop community, but this wasn't just any ordinary arrest. This was a major one, and Jim Jones wasn't dealing with a simple charge or a legal misunderstanding this time. Against him were so serious that legal professionals were already predicting that he would face life in jail. It all began with a number of federal officials attacked at least 3 places linked to Jim Jones, including a residence where he was in early morning raids, according to several sources. Witnesses who were apparently staying recalled a dramatic scene with highly armed cops, SUVs that were blacked out, and the obvious anxiety that arises when the federal government makes a high-profile arrest. One witness who lives close to the scene of Jim's arrest said that the sound of a loud banging on a door woke them up. Within minutes, Jim Jones was talking so loudly that the witness said they were ordering someone inside to come out with their hands up. Seemed stunned but calm as they were led away in handcuffs. But the true issue was, what had Jim Jones done to warrant such rumors of a high-stakes arrest first circulated? Some said it was a mistake, while others hypothesized that it was connected to previous instances coming up to him. But suddenly the first significant leak began to surface, and sources said that the reality was far more bizarre than anybody had anticipated. It wasn't simply a random bust. The FBI had allegedly been keeping tabs on Jim Jones for years and had assembled a solid case using wire surveillance. The situation became even more stunning when they revealed the accusations against the surveillance and undercover agents who had finally made their move. Jim Jones was reportedly connected to a vast criminal enterprise that went well beyond music, according to many federal sources. Authorities thought they had evidence that connected him to money laundering, illegal financial activities, and perhaps drug trafficking, but it didn't stop them. The FBI claims that J. Jones was not just involved in unlawful conduct, but was also a significant role, and that they have financial, in addition to documents and even whistleblowers who have given thorough descriptions of his participation. Jim's closest friend had the largest bondel yet. Flipped. According to reports, Jim's close buddy and business colleague was arrested months ago on unrelated this individual, who faces severe jail sentences, reportedly struck a deal with federal prosecutors in which they agreed to give over all they were aware of Jim Jones. And the information they gave was said to be so damaging that it validated the Fed's presumptions. Once they got the proof lined up, they didn't hesitate, and the raid occurred. According to law enforcement officials, the operation was meticulously designed to guarantee Jim Jones. With no way out, the feds quickly rushed in, striking many places at once to gather evidence and stop any important papers or documents from being burned. And news soon surfaced that many other people were also imprisoned in addition to Jim Jones, as he suggested that this could not be a single instance but rather a component of a much bigger federal probe. A horrifying ask who else was involved, since if the feds had been working on this case for years, they couldn't have stopped at Jim alone. Pondering if additional rappers are related, whether moral arrests are imminent, and possibly most importantly, whether Jim Jones would remain mute or begin speaking because the pressure to reach a settlement becomes unbearable when someone faces life in jail, and they now have all the necessary proof. This was the worst situation for June Jones, because if even one member of this network chose to join with the federal government, everything may get out of hand quickly, and that's precisely what happened next, according to sources inside the inquiry. Jim's close friend had already begun speaking. Although the identity was kept secret, others in the profession knew precisely who it was. And Jim felt betrayed right away because snitching was the worst crime in the world of hip-hop. And now that someone had betrayed him, Jim's Levo team was rushing to get a lawyer. One of the greatest in the industry was already attempting to repair the damage and released a statement asserting that Jim was innocent and that this was a setup. And further instance of a prosperous black guy being singled out by the system. But the issue was that the evidence was mounting, with reports indicating the FBI had not only wiretapped talks, but also had collected emails, texts, and even video footage that purportedly connected JY to high-level meetings with specific people under investigation. Followed by the greatest surprise yet. The fans were investigating Jim's background in addition to his current actions. People's long-forgotten links and past cases suddenly came back into the public eye, and the term nine-tray gangster began to circulate. Once again, many began to wonder whether this had anything to do with the turmoil from years before. Some admirers contended that Jim had already cut himself off from that world. While some were unsure, others were discussing other rappers, industry insiders, and even old associates on the streets. Everyone had an opinion, said that Jim had developed some enemies over the years, and that perhaps this was all part of a bigger plot to bring him down. After someone ultimately took the decision to bring him in for retribution, another arrest was made. This time by someone who was intimately connected to Jim's news channel, began airing tales about a hip-hop conspiracy around SE transactions and a possible RICO lawsuit, and the media went into a frenzy. That may bring down Jim as well as a number of other important figures. The internet was ablaze with ideas about who else the FBI was considering. Was this the Jim was first on the verge of suffering the same fate as other rappers who were embroiled in Le Problème? The uncertainty added to the intensity of the scenario. But Jim, he was quiet, made no public remarks, posted on social media, or spoke with anybody outside of his legal team. He was sitting in isolation in a secured room because the largest whatever occurred next. One thing was certain: the worst was far from over. The issue was still whether he would fight this or make a bargain to preserve himself. Jim Jones was confronted with the most difficult reality of his life behind the frigid walls of the Federal Detention Center, where he had spent years establishing his profession. He had made millions and established himself as one of the most reputable figures in hip-hop. But now he was just another prisoner wearing an orange jumpsuit. Waiting for his destiny to time had slowed to a crawl within, even though the outside world was moving quickly. Every minute brought fresh anxiety since regardless of how tough he seemed to be, or how much he convinced himself that he could win this case, he knew deep down that the FBI wasn't playing games and that they had something significant. And if he didn't act wisely, this may be the end. Jim had previously dealt with legal issues, but this time there was a sense of closure. The world beyond the prison walls was still humming with the strong feeling that this time there was no way out of the repercussions. The media was constantly analyzing every aspect, and the supporters were divided. Some were supporting him, while others believed he was guilty. But the true misery started when the government took action. Federal prosecutors charged Jim with several offenses, citing just the press briefing was explosive, as authorities acknowledged that this investigation wasn't only about Jim after finding financial evidence and hidden witness testimony. We're pursuing his whole business. It was a Rio case. For those who are not acquainted, the claim against corrupt and ASO racketeer influence groups is among the most significant legal tools that the government may use. They were first created to overthrow drug cartels, mafia lords, and criminal empires. The business was rocked by the news about Jim Jones, and everyone knew that the conviction rate was high. Jones's meetings with important players in an underground organization was among the evidence. Financial documents connecting him to questionable payments and offshore activities, financial wiretaps, recording talks regarding financial transactions and other interactions. Oh, and here's where it gets even worse. Despite Jim's current success in avoiding serious legal issues, his past might work against him. Years. Some of his prior connections may be used against him in court. Prosecutors may argue that this was a pattern rather than a single error. This suggests that Jim Jones may be defending himself against a decades-long case for which the government has been waiting for the right opportunity, rather than simply one accusation. To bring down on him, and now that time had arrived, Jim Jones was being detained without bail, with the government claiming that since he was a flight RIS, so he would be in jail until this trial unless something extraordinary occurred. And speaking of the trial, it's another catastrophe just waiting to happen, because Jim Jones and his legal team were facing an uphill battle with this amount of information, and the largest question still standing was whether Jim was really involved. There were already rumors circulating in the business that Jim Jones was being unjustly singled out, so some people think this was a setup. Successful black artists are being targeted by the government, which uses their tenuous ties to illegal activities as a pretext for sweeping down others, thought Jim had been set up and that the person who betrayed him was lying to protect themselves. But then, a startling new information emerged because sources said that the FBI wasn't finished yet, and that there were even more arrests planned, indicating that this case was about to become even. Jim Jones sat in the antiseptic, frigid FBI, and if he wasn't working alone, the next issue was, who else was going to be brought down? His wrists were shackled to the table in the interrogation room, and his thoughts were racing. Only hours before, he had been going about his daily business without realizing that federal investigators were there. Were approaching, and he was now caught in a nightmare. To make matters worse, the FBI wasn't pursuing him alone. They were pursuing everyone involved because Jim wasn't working alone at first. According to leak sources, and when word of his arrest spread on social media, most followers thought it was simply another. Perhaps there was a little misunderstanding that could be resolved with the help of a knowledgeable attorney and the appropriate contacts. But when the specifics began to surface, realized that this was far more serious than anybody had anticipated. It wasn't a simple police stop or a little legal matter. Rather, it was a full-scale federal. Within minutes, news sites were rushing for information on the operation, which the FBI had been monitoring for years. TMZ, The Shaving Room, and Hip Hop DX all began investigating the matter and asking insiders for any information on what was really happening. Before the first significant leak appeared online, according to a Jim Jones, a senior law enforcement source, was purportedly captured on many FBI recordings, not just once or twice, but several times, and these weren't simply informal exchanges that were designed to imply that Jim was fully aware of what was happening, and fans immediately took to social media to debate if he had been engaged in something far larger than anybody had anticipated. Others stated they always thought something was happening behind the scenes, while others refused to accept that Jim had really done what the FBI was suggesting. The greatest surprise, however, was when sources began to imply that Jim wasn't the only one engaged since, based on reports, the FBI wasn't merely the second round of arrests started a few hours after Jim Jones was brought into custody because they were looking into a whole network. Rumors began to circulate that another prominent person had been taken into custody. First, no one knew who the FBI was keeping secret, but the rumors quickly circulated, with some claiming it was a fellow rapper and others that it was one of Jim's closest business associates. However, everyone agreed that Jim was in danger. But as the rumors spread, another shocking revelation was made since, based on recently released court papers, this case included more than simply money. It also involved significant industrial connections, power, and influence. The FBI had been watching money transfers. Numerous of his old associates were captured in coordinated operations across numerous states, one by one. After following leads and listening in on private talks, they were taken in for interrogation since the government just needed one of them to speak. And when that occurred, someone snapped. At first, there were just whispers, but shortly after, rumors circulated that one of Jim's closest associates had consented to work with the government. Huge betrayal. According to legal, this was someone who had supported Jim for years, not just some low-level someone attempting to rescue themselves. Insiders revealed that the witness had given important information on financial transactions, private meetings, and coded signals. Worse, the federal government had. When leaked audio from an undercover informant appeared, the internet went crazy. The audio was muffled and distorted, but it was still clear enough to identify the voices. Jim Jones was purportedly one of them, and the audio recording of their discussion was incriminating. Jim could be heard talking about something really suspected coded language and V allusions, but law enforcement found it sufficient and the video went viral. Being published by all major news outlets and examined by fans from throughout the globe discussed it on social media, with some claiming it was fabricated and others saying it was taken out of context. But one thing was for sure: the damage had been done. The scenario took a different turn as the evidence mounted, and the prosecution began to target not only Jim, but his family operation. Further subpoenas were sent out. More persons were taken in for interrogation, and as the strain increased, cracks began to appear in those who had, after swearing allegiance to JY, all of his friends stopped talking to him, and those in the business who had previously stood by him began to distance themselves, cutting him off of social media. And then the case took a huge turn when the FBI found a concealed financial trail. A set of transactions that purportedly connected him to offshore accounts. Covert investments and potential money laundering. This wasn't about a single transaction, one exchange, or one discussion. This was years of transactions meticulously disguised till now. Jim's defense team quickly disputed everything. They claimed it was all a misunderstanding, that the government was fabricating evidence to make him seem guilty. But Jim was aware of the reality. He was running out of possibilities. Jim's team was already planning for the worst. They were considering plea bargaining tactics to lessen the harm and everything that may prevent Jim from being imprisoned for the remainder of his life. But Jim wasn't prepared to give up, at least not yet, until the last betrayal by a former close buddy. Jim was devastated to learn that someone he had trusted, such as his family, had gone on record and consented to testify against him. This wasn't just some stranger seeking a plea bargain. This individual knew everything. When the news broke, the industry exploded, with other rappers weighing in and some supporting Jim. Others who felt he was being set up kept quiet since they knew that hanging around with him may also put them on the Fed's radar. But the most terrifying aspect of all was the insiders' claim that the government wasn't stopping here, and that the FBI had a lengthy list of names, of whom Jim Jones was just the first. This was more significant than Jim Jones was sitting in his jail cell, staring at the cold concrete walls, his thoughts racing, and the frightening thing was that his case was far from done. He was confined in a cage after being on top of the world for weeks, making deals and enjoying the kind of life that many others could only imagine. The facts of his case had completely solidified in the evidence against him, making him feel like an animal under the weight of the whole federal government. He was piling up, and his alleged supporters were vanishing one by one, either by making agreements with the federal government or by just separating themselves in order to avoid loyalty. Talk was common in the rap business. But as the pressure mounted, Jim understood how easily that allegiance could go, and his lead T had been putting up a fierce struggle to find weaknesses in the government's case. But the feds were unrelenting. They had been constructing this case for years, and they weren't ready to let him to fall between the cracks. And now that fresh information was emerging, things were getting out of hand. The worst setback occurred when the more high-definition surveillance film was made public by the FBI, and it showed Jim speaking in many confidential sessions. Hushed tones making agreements that suddenly seemed inexplicable. Staunchest fans were unable to deny the growing evidence. It was no longer only conjecture. It was now reality, right in front of their eyes. Jim believed he had seen the worst of it, but as the nightmare went on, the FBI made additional arrests and brought in other important individuals who had been working in the background. They weren't only obscure individuals, they were well-known names who had earned respect in the field. Jim Jones wasn't working alone, as seen by the brutal headlines and the further arrests made in federal custody. The media was thoroughly analyzing every bit of data, dissecting every aspect and portraying Jim as the head of a vast criminal enterprise, a reputation that had taken years to overnight. The climate behind the prison walls was changing, and his name became associated with corruption, criminality, and treachery. At first, he was seen differently by other prisoners. There had been respect since he was Jim Jones, a legendary figure in the rap industry, a guy who had created an empire. But with rumors of plea bargains and snitching circulating, the respect was eroding into mistrust. And the unwritten laws of the streets didn't alter just because you were well known. If anybody had even the slightest suspicion that Jim may turn informant, his jail sentence would take on a whole new dimension. Every time he passed through the corridors, he felt the tension, and every time he sat in the cafeteria, he could feel eyes watching him. His LAL team gave him an ultimatum as his final, best opportunity to avoid spending the remainder of his life waiting to see what he would do next. The prosecution offered the plea deal in life behind bars, which would drastically lower his sentence. But there was a catch if Jim desired a chance at freedom. But in order to do so, he had to cooperate, testify, give up his identity, and assist the FBI construct their case against more powerful targets. The traditional tactic is to turn the tables on superiors to protect oneself. But for Jim, this wasn't only a legal ruling. It was a matter of honoring his survival heritage. His war lay out everything in the little, darkly lit legal consulting room. And if he accepted the bargain, he might be out in 10 years or less, or perhaps even sooner with good conduct. If he didn't, he would probably end himself behind bars since the conviction rate wasn't in his favor. In federal prosecutions was astounding. If the government targeted you, they almost invariably succeeded. Jim had always taken pleasure in being a survivor on overcoming insurmountable obstacles. But this was unique. It wasn't a label dispute, an industry feud, or a financial hardship. This was a federal prison, and the government wasn't playing games. He considered his kid, his family, and those who had dependent on him for years. What would happen to them if he was put up forever? Would they still stick by him, or would they go on forget about him like... There were a lot of people who had perished before him, and then there was the industry, the streets, and the unspoken regulations that had ruled his no matter what justifications he used or how he explained it to others. If he accepted this arrangement and participated, his reputation would be permanently damaged, would consider him a snitch, and in this environment such designation not only destroyed careers, but also lives. He considered Tekashi 6ix9ine and how the tale had played out. Tekanashi had complied, struck a bargain, and left. But at what cost? His credibility was ruined, and he was still creating songs continues to get views. But he, Jim, could never be respected again. Could he sacrifice his honor to live with that? For his liberty, the idea made his stomach turn. The deal's expiration date was approaching. His lawyers informed him that he had little time to make a decision about the feds were pressing hard and moving quickly. If he didn't accept the offer, it would now possibly off the table later. He had to decide that evening as he was lying on he felt in jail C as he stared at the ceiling. A pressure he had never experienced before prior to then. His whole life had been about taking action to remain ahead of the game, but now he felt for the first time really stuck. Regardless of the choice, he helped him realize that if he took, he lost his reputation after the agreement. Heritage. If he didn't, he was deprived of his liberty, his destiny. The guards the next morning arrived to take him to a different meeting. When he strolled down with his legal team, his thoughts were still racing along the corridor. The industry was waiting for fans. Jim and the feds were waiting. Jones was on the verge of making the largest life-altering choice. But what would he decide whether he was going to accept the offer and turn against those he used to call family? Or would he battle to the death? Conclusion. Even if it meant confronting a life sentence, one thing was obvious. Whatever. His tale, he concluded, was far from Jim Jones's destiny, now looms large in the equilibrium with the FBI strengthening their grasp the emerging facts and High's inner circle dissolving the query. Still, will he accept the offer, or will he sacrifice all to keep his identity safe? The hip-hop community is shattered and fans are split. And the sector is keeping a careful eye on, according to some, Jim Jones has no option except to collaborate and flip while others quarrel that he wouldn't compromise the code of the streets. But let's face it, we have seen strong individuals collapse before, and it is difficult for feds to lose cases if they have additional proof that Jim might be dealing with a destiny worse than anybody could have predicted. What do you anticipate happening next? Will Jim take the agreement, or will he remain quiet and retaliate by putting your ideas in the "do you think he was?" based on the responses below? Really engaged? Or is this just another make sure you like this government arrangement? Turn on and subscribe to the video. Alerts, because to the distance of this article, as additional information becomes available, we'll be providing you with unique Jim updates. The actual facts behind the Jones case, the FBI's inquiry, and the potential "you won't be good for hip-hop's future." Stay connected and locked if you don't want to miss it. And see you in the next release, as this lawsuit will soon take an even more bizarre turn and